The air in the opulent room was a heavy blend of aged red wine. The sharp, clean scent of pine needles from the towering Christmas tree, and an undeniable metallic tang of danger. Soft golden lights, painstakingly strung around the elaborate molding of the walls, cast an illusion of warmth and safety. Everyone here was participating in the polite fiction that this was simply another innocuous holiday gathering in Italy. Full of muted laughter, clinking glasses, and background orchestral music. It was a brutal lie. I didn't need to see him to know he was present. I felt the change in the atmosphere first. It was a thermodynamic shift, a sudden drop in ambient pressure, a profound stillness that stole the oxygen from the air. It was as if the very molecules in the room had recognized who had crossed the threshold and collectively decided to hold their breath. Then, his voice materialized from the space directly behind my ear. It was low, unnervingly calm, and devastatingly lethal. "Tonight," he breathed. The heat of his promise an almost unbearable sensation as it brushed against the sensitive skin of my neck. "Every single part of you will be mine." My grip involuntarily tightened around the stem of the heavy glass I was holding. The expensive Chianti inside trembled violently, dangerously close to spilling over the rim. Instinct screamed at me. I should have spun on my heel and fled. I should have finally listened to every terrible warning I had ever internalized. But I didn't. Instead, my breath hitched and raggedly pulled itself into my lungs. When the most feared and absolute ruler of Italy's underground chooses you, fate is not a request. It is a brutal, finalized decree. I did not require a visual confirmation of his identity. His name was the currency of whispers, known everywhere from Palermo to Milan. Men who dared defy him were not granted second chances. They were erased. Entire families spoke his name in hushed tones, a simultaneous prayer for protection and a curse of acknowledgement. He maintained absolute control without ever needing to raise his voice or instigate visible chaos. His terrifying power resided in silence, in precision, and in the space between heartbeats. And now, that same terrifying silence was palpable, breathing down my neck. Slowly, almost agonizingly, I pivoted. Our eyes locked. They were dark, impenetrable pools, steady and entirely unreadable, windows sealed against intrusion. He was clad entirely in black, the fabric of his suit custom-tailored to lethal perfection, making him look less like a man and more like the night itself had been meticulously shaped just for his form. His sheer presence did not just occupy the space between us. It aggressively swallowed it. He was not smiling, yet the dangerous certainty etched into his features conveyed something far worse. The quiet, chilling confidence of a man who already possessed the final page of my story. "You look like you are moments away from turning tail and running," he observed, his voice completely level. I managed to reply, astonished that the words left my throat without fracturing. A minute, almost imperceptible corner of his mouth twitched upward. It was not a sign of amusement, but of cold, clinical approval. "Good," he said. "That means your instincts are sharp enough to understand exactly who I am." I understood, yes, and that precise understanding was what fueled the seismic terror currently ripping through me. The orchestrated murmur of the party continued seamlessly behind us. Laughter echoed brightly from a distant corner of the room. People moved, drank, talked, and lived their normal lives, completely oblivious that a universe-altering negotiation was happening nearby. My world, however, had violently constricted down to the singular, suffocating presence of the man standing before me. "You shouldn't be here," I whispered, the absurdity of the situation catching in my throat. "And neither should you," he countered immediately. His words struck with unnecessary force because they carried the undeniable weight of truth. I was utterly misplaced in a setting defined by concealed wealth and predatory power. I possessed no influence, no protective connections, and no family name heavy enough to serve as armor. I was simply me, formerly invisible, painfully ordinary. Or at least that definition had served me until this very moment. His gaze dropped briefly, sweeping across me with an intimacy that made my pulse violently leap, before snapping back to my eyes. It was controlled, measured, the meticulous focus of a supreme predator who consciously chooses patience over immediate hunger. "I do not touch what I have no intention of keeping permanently," he stated, the declaration quiet but final. My heart slammed a panicked rhythm against my ribs. "Is that supposed to offer me some form of comfort?" I challenged, hoping my voice sounded braver than I felt. "No," he replied with chilling honesty. "It is a clear warning." The golden Christmas lights above us stuttered briefly. Distant church bells chimed, signaling the inevitable march toward midnight, and with it, the onset of something irreversible and terrifying. "Why me?" I asked, the question barely audible, just a ghost of a sound. He studied my face intently, as if the complex answer were somehow encoded within my features. "Because you remain entirely oblivious to the unique danger you represent," he finally articulated. "And perhaps simply because fate, in its purest form, delights in being profoundly cruel." A deep shiver racked my body. It was not derived solely from pure, debilitating fear, but from the strange, gravitational pull anchoring me firmly to this spot. All my life, I had diligently navigated around every potential storm, seeking the quietest harbors. Yet here I was now, inexplicably planted in the eye of a destructive hurricane, utterly incapable of choosing retreat. He leaned in, closing the final, minimal distance, ensuring that his next words were for my ears only. "From this precise moment forward," he stated, his voice steady and utterly unbreakable, "your life will never again have the luxury of being small." I knew intellectually I should have forcefully rejected him. I should have taken the decisive step backward. Instead, I simply held his gaze, and in doing so, I willingly stepped across a definitive line, one that I would never possess the power to uncross. Across the entire nation of Italy, his name was known, even by those who hypocritically pretended ignorance. Men didn't fear him because he engaged in public cruelty or noisy displays of power. They feared him because he was exacting, precise, and utterly reliable. Enemies did not vanish amid the chaos of a gunfight. They quietly evaporated, leaving no witnesses, no discernible stories, only hollow spaces where prominent people once existed. His reign was upheld without a single shouted command. The uniform of his legend consisted of black suits, cold, assessing eyes, and violence so meticulously controlled it felt like an equation. That was how the legends were forged. He rarely condescended to attend such gatherings, but when he did, the entire spatial dynamics of the room subtly recalibrated around him. Conversations instantly softened to anxious murmurs. Confident smiles stiffened into masks of professional deference. Even the most powerful politicians and rival leaders instinctively recalled their absolute best manners. Respect clung to him like an unavoidable, ever-present shadow, dark, silent, and impossible to outrun. He was, without argument, Italy's reigning Mafia monarch, though the title of king was a word too weighty and too dangerous for anyone to utter aloud. Power such as his required no formal designation. The women who passed through his life were transient, interchangeable, seasonal changes, briefly desired, quickly replaced, and never permitted to linger long enough to become relevant. Desire was an acceptable transaction. Attachment, however, was a fatal weakness. Nothing soft or vulnerable was allowed to survive within the boundaries of his world. The stories claimed his heart was interred beneath layers of concrete and betrayal, buried alongside the bodies of those who challenged him, and perhaps with the last shred of innocence he shed long before power found him. He trusted no soul entirely. He permitted himself to love nothing openly. Control, absolute, precise, unwavering, was his sole religion. And yet, here, on this soft, deceptive Christmas night, his legendary control dangerously wavered. This wasn't due to mere temptation or a momentary lapse of loneliness. It faltered because he saw me. From the instant he stepped past the doorway, his entire, formidable attention was locked onto a single stationary point. It wasn't the conniving politicians, the rival leaders exchanging fake smiles and whispered threats, or the high-stakes deals being negotiated in corners. It was me. I hadn't registered it initially. I was too consumed by the anxiety of trying to inhabit a space that actively rejected me, too preoccupied with the exhausting act of pretending I wasn't hopelessly out of my depth. But he noticed everything. He always did. He observed the subtle way I positioned myself, slightly isolated, poised as if ready to execute an emergency exit at any moment. He saw the careful, quick movement of my eyes. Curious, yes, but fundamentally cautious. Not greedy for attention, not impressed by the glittering veneer of power. I was unclaimed. That quality, above all others, was what had seized his focus. Men who controlled the world were never interested in women who chased power. They sought the ones who didn't even perceive its existence. The rare souls who hadn't yet realized the devastating, quiet danger they represented to a man built entirely on restraint. Even as he watched from across the velvet expanse of the room, his external expression remained perfectly fixed, calm, distant, utterly unreadable. But deep inside, an unprecedented tremor rocked his foundation. A formidable line he had sworn on his life never to breach began to tremble under the gravitational weight of a single, catastrophic realization. Asterisk, she does not belong in this hellish world, and what's worse, she doesn't even know that. Asterisk, he had dedicated decades to perfecting the art of emotional restraint, painstakingly constructing psychological walls so thick that nothing living could ever pierce them. But fate, he learned, was not polite. It did not knock. It found the minute hairline fractures you never knew existed and slipped through them like corrosive acid. He did not approach immediately. He watched, using my existence as a testing ground for his formidable patience, allowing the holiday night to proceed in its usual, predictable, and controlled fashion. But the longer he waited, the brutally clearer the truth became. This was not fleeting curiosity. It was a potent, seismic recognition. When he finally initiated movement, it was devastatingly deliberate. There was no haste, no visible urgency. He moved with the languid certainty of a man who already knew the conclusion and was merely permitting the narrative to catch up. By the time his low voice reached my ear, he had finalized a decision so dangerous it should have been illegal. He did not merely want to possess my body. He intended to fundamentally alter my life. For the first time in an untold number of years, Italy's most dreaded mafia sovereign was not preoccupied with plotting the demise of enemies or expanding his shadowy empire. He was calculating the terrifying cost of keeping one utterly defenseless woman safe within a world specifically constructed to destroy her kind. And that, he understood, was the most destructive thought of all. Men like him never succumbed to a slow, gentle descent. They fell once, catastrophically, and when they did, they were known to incinerate everything surrounding them to safeguard the singular thing they claimed as their own. And on that fateful Christmas night, in the deep shadow of his reign, he chose me. I belonged nowhere near his world. My existence was constructed entirely from safe routines, not breathtaking risks. It comprised early, predictable mornings, long, unremarkable workdays, and quiet evenings where absolute nothing ever happened. I labored, survived, and cultivated my profound invisibility because invisibility, I had been taught, was synonymous with safety. It was a quality I had diligently learned to prize above all else. There were no heavily armed guards flanking me, no concealed weapons tucked into my clothing, and no volatile secrets waiting to detonate. I was merely a girl striving to live a quiet life in a chaotic city that truly never slept. I traversed the identical streets every single day, passed the same local cafes, and exchanged nods with the same familiar, worn faces. To the outside world, I was harmless, instantly forgettable, and that was precisely how I preferred it. Being noticed had never once yielded a positive outcome. I harbored no aspirations for luxury or influence. My only dream was simple peace. A life where no one ever demanded more than I was prepared to give. Where I could breathe without the necessity of constantly looking over my shoulder. Men of his caliber did not genuinely exist within the boundaries of my rational reality. They were confined to chilling headlines, terrified whispers, and deep, unreachable shadows. They were the subjects of solemn warnings mothers imparted to their daughters. Stories recounted in voices deliberately lowered to prevent the darkness from hearing. I had never conceived of the horrifying possibility that one of them might actually notice me. And yet, Even prior to the encounter on Christmas night, an insidious shift had already begun. I sensed it in small, utterly unexplainable ways. It was a feeling of being observed, not with malice or fear, but with an intense, analytical awareness. As if some unseen entity had meticulously memorized the subtle rhythm of my entire ordinary life. I had attempted to rationalize it away. Life had trained me never to examine moments of calm too closely, understanding that tranquility could shatter if stared at for too long. I was wrong. The grim irony is that quiet girls, the ones who seek the periphery, invariably draw the deepest, most destructive storms. We fail to announce ourselves. We do not demand or seek attention. We merely slip through life unnoticed. And for men who are the absolute masters of chaos, that quiet anonymity becomes intensely intriguing. A pristine mystery, completely untouched by the contamination of their own brutal world. I remained oblivious that while I was successfully blending into the flow of anonymous crowds, another man stood purposefully apart, diligently observing everything, including me. He had been watching, not following me in a frantic pursuit, not stalking with irrational intent, but watching from vantage points so discreet and unexpected I would never have registered them. Initially, it wasn't driven by heated obsession, but by cold, intellectual curiosity. He registered patterns the way other men might assess transcendent beauty. The specific, quiet cafe I chose when I required momentary solitude. The fractional pause I took before committing to crossing a busy street. My habitual choice to always select a table near an exit. Survival instincts. That was the exact moment I first crossed the threshold of his consciousness. Not as a woman, not as a fleeting temptation, but as a fascinating entity. Someone who possessed a profound, innate understanding of danger, yet had never actually been forced to inhabit the heart of it. When I finally stepped into that grand, candlelit room on Christmas night, I still maintained the desperate belief that I was anonymous. Just one more disposable face in a sea of guests. I failed to comprehend that I had already been irrevocably marked. Not for immediate destruction or harm, but for fierce, proprietary protection. In his world, attention was never a passive accident. Every single focal point was deliberately, meticulously chosen. The moment our eyes finally connected, it was not a beginning. It was the stark, horrifying culmination. The instant two utterly separate timelines acknowledged the singular, inescapable truth they had been racing toward, that I was no longer invisible, and that he had irrevocably decided to step out of his carefully constructed, suffocating darkness and into the exposed fragility of my quiet life. I had no comprehension of the ultimate cost yet, nor the sheer scale of the disruption awaiting me. All I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, was that the silence I had painstakingly built my entire life upon was actively shattering. And somewhere in the deepest, most protected recess of my soul, a voice whispered something terrifying and undeniable. Nothing will ever be the same again. There existed an unspoken, absolute boundary that people like me, the ordinary, the overlooked, were genetically programmed never to transgress. It wasn't enshrined in law. It was felt in the marrow of every person who understood the world's natural order. And he, in his totality, was that line. Men of his power did not occupy the same physics as common lives. They moved relentlessly above the rules, far outside the constraints of law, and entirely beyond consequences. You never accidentally brushed against them in a crowd. You waited to be summoned before daring to speak. And you certainly did not look at them with the raw, undefended scrutiny I had just offered him. To step even marginally into his shadow was to forfeit the possibility of returning unchanged. I registered this fundamental truth the very instant our gazes locked. The elegant room dissolved around us. The music seemed to fade into a distant, muffled hum. The cheerful warmth of the Christmas lights retreated, seeming to belong to a completely separate, unreachable life. His gaze held mine. Steady, unblinking, weighted down by a quality I couldn't name, yet which felt ancient and terribly final. It transcended simple desire or fear. It was recognition. It was the simultaneous, chilling understanding that an invisible, crucial boundary had just been vaporized without either of us having taken a single physical step. I fiercely commanded myself to look away, to feign ignorance of the seismic pull in my chest. That strange, suffocating tightness that made breathing a conscious effort. Yet my body remained stubbornly disobedient. It stayed rooted, immovable, as if it already possessed the terrible knowledge that attempting to run would now achieve nothing but a quicker capture. He tilted his head infinitesimally, studying me with an unsettling thoroughness. This was not the typical scrutiny of male hunger or impatient desire. He looked at me with the focused intensity of a complex geopolitical problem he intended to solve, or perhaps an inevitable truth he had patiently waited years to finally confirm. I briefly considered the countless others who must have stood in this exact spot, directly across from him, and how many had paid for crossing that invisible line with their peace, their liberty, or their very lives. My entire life had been a meticulously constructed exercise in caution. Caution was my primary method of survival. It was how I ensured I remained completely untainted by the surrounding chaos. Yet here I was, standing motionless, staring directly into the dark eyes of a man who was the absolute definition of chaos, feeling the structural integrity of my painstakingly careful life begin its inevitable fracture. This is a catastrophic mistake, I internally screamed. But the acknowledgement arrived far too late to matter. He took a single, deliberate step forward, not quite invading my personal space, but enough to make his sheer, overwhelming proximity an undeniable physical fact. The already thin air felt suddenly heavier, pressurized. My pulse instantly betrayed me, surging forward in frantic leaps. "You are actively contemplating flight," he stated quietly. It was an observation, devoid of question. "Yes," I confirmed, even though my feet felt cemented to the polished floor. A flicker, a bare hint of something softened his gaze. "You absolutely should," he advised. That sentence should have been the decisive conclusion. The warning had been issued, the line clearly marked. But then he added the devastating rider, "And yet you won't." I swallowed hard against the sudden dryness in my throat. Asterisk, you have no way of knowing that. Asterisk, I do, he countered calmly, his logic cold and inescapable. Because you are still standing here. The crushing truth of his words settled like lead in my chest. I realized then that the dividing line was not merely external, separating his dark world from my mundane one. It ran deep inside me. The chasm between the girl who believed safety was achieved through distance and the nascent woman who was terrifyingly realizing that some singular forces, some destructive people, were simply unavoidable. "I do not belong in your world," I insisted, a desperate plea hidden in the declaration. "No," he agreed, devoid of judgment or malice, stating only an undisputed fact. "You certainly do not. But your world," he continued, leaning in just enough to deliver the final blow, "is about to undergo a complete, irreversible transformation." A profound, sickening chill coursed through me. This was the precise moment the truth solidified. This was not a flirtation. This was not transient danger. This was a terminal turning point. A massive door slamming shut behind me while another, dark and infinitely unknown, creaked open ahead. Once a line of this gravity was crossed, the concept of retreat ceased to exist. And even though I hadn't physically moved, hadn't touched him, and hadn't dared to speak his forbidden name, I had already crossed it. Because the truly perilous boundaries are never etched into the ground. They are drawn with the unwavering hand of fate. He required no physical contact. His presence alone was an overwhelming, self-sustaining force, capable of bending the very fabric of the room around him. Not physically, but in a way that bore far more consequence. The volume of surrounding conversation noticeably softened. Laughter seemed to recede, drifting into an unreachably distant sphere. I could feel the tremendous weight of his singular attention, pressing against my back like a heavy, invisible hand. It was not overtly aggressive or rushed. It was utterly controlled, infinitely patient, and this calculated restraint made the sensation exponentially more unsettling. "You do not belong here," I asserted, forcing the definitive statement out before my fragile courage completely evaporated. It was the absolute truth for both of us. His lips curved, slightly, not quite forming a smile, but close enough to send a staggering jolt through my system. "Neither do you," he replied. The words impacted me with unexpected devastation, primarily because he wasn't incorrect. I had been silently echoing that very sentiment since I first entered, knowing I was out of place, fearing the night would swallow me whole if I didn't flee. "You should depart," he advised calmly. I blinked, confused by the contradiction. "You just explicitly stated that I do not belong here." "Yes, then why are you not moving out of my path?" His gaze deepened slowly, deliberately, focusing with predatory intensity. "Because I am curious to observe what you will choose to do." The sheer, raw honesty of his reply stole the breath from my lungs. I grasped then that this was not a simple trial of bravery. It was a dangerous, primal test of instinct. Every sensible, logical component of my mind was screaming an urgent, biological imperative to bolt. Taking a slow, measured breath, I risked the next truth. "People like you systematically ruin lives." He offered no denial. "People like me," he corrected, his voice flat, "end lives as well." There was not a hint of pride or overt menace in his tone, only cold, factual certainty. A violent tremor passed through me, and his eyes, sharp and quick, registered it immediately. They flickered down to my hands, noting the tight, white-knuckled curl of my fingers. "You are demonstrably afraid," he observed. "Yes," I admitted, the word quiet but firm. "And yet," he noted, his voice laced with dangerous curiosity, "you are still standing exactly where you were." The ensuing silence stretched taut between us, thick with unspoken, complex acknowledgments. I could feel him analyzing me. My terror, my momentary hesitation, the flicker of defiance. "What is it that you want?" I finally asked, unable to bear the weight of his silence. He studied me for what felt like an eternity, assessing the question before delivering his answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was reduced to a drop-dead seriousness meant for my ears alone. "To understand, fundamentally, why fate deemed it necessary to put you directly in my path." My heart hammered against my ribs with such alarming force I was convinced he could hear its desperate rhythm. "This is not fate," I insisted. "It is merely a party." That fractional, almost smile returned. "That," he stated softly, "is precisely what fate invariably looks like at the beginning." "You should actively maintain a distance from me," he declared. "That was exactly my intention," I replied truthfully. "Good," he murmured, the sound deceptively soft. "That indicates you still believe you possess a choice." The words should have provided some minor reassurance. Instead, they triggered a terrifying realization. Men of his stature did not waste precious energy issuing warnings unless they genuinely cared about and intended to dictate the final outcome. As I shifted my weight, preparing to definitively leave this time, his voice halted me mid-movement. "Tell me your name." I hesitated, the impulse to refuse overwhelming. Names, in his world, carried tangible power. To hand him mine felt like surrendering the last piece of independent leverage I possessed, like crossing the final visible line. Yet I answered. He repeated it once, very quietly, testing the resonance of the syllables, as if judging how the sound felt on his tongue. The sound of my name, spoken by him, wrapped around me like a heavy, inescapable promise. "Now," he said, fixing my eyes with his again, "we are no longer strangers." I walked away immediately after that, forcing my body to move through the thinning crowd. I did not risk a glance backward. But even as I moved, surrounded by oblivious people, I knew that the universe had tilted on its axis. The first collision had already occurred. There was no touch, no stolen kiss, and certainly no clean escape. And somehow, the sheer lack of physical contact made the encounter far more volatile and dangerous than any action he could have taken. I desperately believed that putting distance between us would conclude the incident, that the strange, overwhelming tension would simply dissipate into a memory I could successfully suppress. I was utterly, dangerously wrong. Men like him did not forget defining collisions. They analyzed them, They studied every single variable. Following that night, the alterations in my life were unnervingly subtle, never dramatic or loud. If anything, my daily existence became suspiciously smooth, too smooth. The faulty streetlight outside my apartment building, which had been flickering uselessly for weeks, was suddenly, expertly repaired. The unsettling figure who routinely loitered near my morning cafe abruptly vanished, never to be seen again. A persistent, complicated issue at my workplace that should have required months of bureaucratic maneuvering simply disappeared overnight. Initially, I tried to dismiss these anomalies as fortunate coincidences, but deep down the cold certainty took root. He hadn't stepped into my life. He had meticulously positioned himself around it. I began to operate under a feeling of incomprehensible protection, as if an impenetrable, invisible shield had been silently erected between me and the harsh realities of the world. Nothing threatening was permitted to touch me unless it had his explicit approval. Nothing harmful was allowed to reach me. This realization, ironically, generated more profound terror than any transparent danger ever could, because such comprehensive protection explicitly implied intense, minute attention. And attention originating from a man of his nature was never, under any circumstances, accidental. He made no calls. He refrained from overtly following me. He never once forced his presence into my designated space. This precise absence was his ultimate expression of control, a restraint so surgically precise that it mimicked genuine respect, even when the intention was purely predatory. Yet, I felt his surveillance in the quiet gaps of my day, in the moments when trouble flared and then instantly receded, in the chilling certainty that if any disaster were to befall me, he would already possess the full details before I even understood what was happening. True obsession, I learned, did not manifest in the wild, desperate ways romantic fiction described. It was calm, ruthlessly focused, and infinitely patient. He was learning the intricate details of my routines not to construct a trap, but to anticipate my future needs, to guarantee that potential danger never, ever reached me before he could intervene. And this realization made everything exponentially worse. Because somewhere in the midst of this silent campaign, I understood the terrifying truth. This was no longer about physical desire. It was about absolute possession. Not ownership of my body, but the total seizure of my safety, my autonomous future, and the totality of my existence. One chilly evening, just as I exited the familiar building after work, I felt the sharp, unmistakable prickle of that awareness again. I didn't bother turning. I didn't need to. You are walking at a significantly faster pace than is typical. His voice materialized beside me, low and lethally controlled. My heart gave a massive lurch, but my steps remained stubbornly quick. That is often the instinctive response when dangerous men address me on supposedly empty streets. He matched my accelerated pace with insulting ease. This street, he informed me, looking straight ahead, is not empty by accident. I finally stopped and genuinely looked at him. The same flawlessly tailored black coat, the same impenetrable eyes. But something in his expression had subtly shifted. Not softened, but intensely settled. You instructed me to stay away from you? I reminded him, my voice tight. And you complied, he acknowledged. You successfully followed my warning. Then why, precisely, are you here? He took a slow beat, his gaze sweeping over the street, the silhouettes of the buildings, the pooling shadows, always calculating, always aware of the periphery. Because staying away from me, he finally stated, does not imply that I cease watching. I halted completely. That statement is fundamentally devoid of comfort, I replied. It is not engineered to provide comfort, he countered calmly. It is engineered to be a clear indication of ownership. Honest. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy like a blanket woven from unspoken threats. You're dangerous, I stated, the realization a dull ache in my throat. Yes, and you're not leaving me alone. No, the admission was steady, certain, rooted in a terrifying clarity. Why? I asked, my voice barely a thread. He looked at me then, truly looked, The way he had that first night when the invisible boundary had been crossed without either of us making a physical move. "Because something about you makes my carefully constructed world unstable," he said, his voice flat, final. "And I don't tolerate instability unless it's worth protecting." My chest tightened painfully, restricting my breath. "This isn't protection," I countered. "It's control." "For men like me," he replied, "the two concepts are the same thing." That was the precise, defining moment I understood the devastating truth. This wasn't a fleeting intrigue. This wasn't intellectual curiosity. Italy's most feared mafia king, the man whose name was a whisper of dread, had decided that I mattered. And when men like him decided that, they didn't simply let go. They adjusted the entire world around them instead. Stay away from him. The warning didn't come once or twice. It came relentlessly, delivered in different voices, shifting tones, always carefully wrapped in layers of genuine concern and profound, paralyzing fear. People didn't use his actual name when they issued the warning. They never did. His name carried a specific, lethal weight, and speaking it aloud felt like issuing a dangerous invitation to trouble. He destroys everything he loves. They delivered this line like a proven fact, not a baseless rumor, like something already settled, already paid for in a high currency of blood. I listened. I genuinely did. I nodded, offered vague promises of distance, and diligently told myself I was being careful because, on the surface, the warnings were rational. Men like him were not built for gentle endings or soft departures. They left vast ruins behind them. Shattered lives, broken families, innocence burned away by proximity. And yet, none of those articulate, carefully phrased warnings prepared me for the quiet, insidious way danger actually arrived. It didn't announce itself with noise or violence. There was no dramatic car chase. No clear, undeniable moment where I suddenly realized my life was at immediate risk. It crept in silently, wearing the deceiving face of normalcy. A man in a plain sedan asking too many specific questions. The same black car slowing down beside me on a deserted street more than once. The subtle, unnerving feeling of being watched, but not in the way I had grown accustomed to under his intense scrutiny. This surveillance felt wrong, alien, predatory. I desperately tried to ignore it. I told myself I was imagining things, allowing irrational fear to bloom where it didn't belong. I didn't want to grant his dangerous world more power over my mundane one by assuming every single shadow harbored his enemies. That lack of urgency, that willful denial, was my second mistake. The night it happened, the narrow street was almost completely empty. The air was biting cold, sharp with the coming winter frost. I was halfway home when the sound of footsteps materialized behind me. Too close, too deliberate, gaining speed. I turned, and the sequence of events changed everything in seconds. I didn't actually see the approach. I only heard the sickening, final sound of a heavy body hitting the pavement. Hard, fast, and definitively final. By the time my shocked mind registered what was happening, he was already there. Blood stained the crisp white cuff of his sleeve, a stark, dark contrast against the expensive black fabric of his suit. His expression was profoundly calm, almost disturbingly serene, as if this sudden violence was merely an inconvenient interruption, not a life-altering crisis. The man on the ground did not move again. I couldn't find my breath. His hand came to rest heavily on my shoulder. It wasn't a grip meant to claim or restrain, but one that was purely grounding, anchoring me to reality. "Don't look," he said quietly. I didn't argue. Couldn't. He smoothly positioned himself between me and the street, his body forming an instant shield without a moment of hesitation. His eyes scanned the darkness, calculating distances, remaining intensely alert. Not angry, not shaken, just entirely in control. "You're safe," he stated. Two deceptively simple words. They should have meant absolutely nothing to me. After everything I'd been explicitly told, after every shrill warning still ringing in my ears, I should have immediately doubted him. I should have violently pulled away, terrified of the man capable of this kind of swift, devastating violence. Instead, I believed him instantly because in that terrible moment, nothing about him felt dangerous to me. Every element of danger had already been surgically removed. My knees suddenly weakened, the massive dose of adrenaline finally crashing through my system. He noticed the shift instantly. "Easy," he murmured, steadying me with a powerful, secure grip. "I've got you." That was when the secondary realization hit me. How effortlessly and naturally he had stepped into the role of protector. How instinctual it was for him to place himself directly in the way of harm without a single question. This was his intrinsic world, and he navigated it with terrifying, fluid ease. "They were watching you," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Testing the waters." "Why?" I whispered, my voice thick with residual shock. His jaw tightened just imperceptibly. "Because they know you matter." The words settled like heavy stones in my chest cavity. "They won't try again," he added, his gaze unwavering. "You don't know that," I challenged, my voice shaking slightly. He met my eyes, his own gaze unyielding, absolute. "Yes," he said calmly. "I do." The faint wail of sirens in the far distance began to grow louder. His men would arrive soon. The night's mess would be cleaned up, erased as if the violence had never occurred. I looked at him then, not as the mythological man everyone feared, but as the concrete man standing directly in front of me, blood on his cuff, an absolute promise burning in his eyes. "They say you destroy everything you love," I said softly, testing the line. His expression darkened instantly, chilling the air between us. "I don't love," he replied. Not yet, he didn't need to say. He helped me home without another word being exchanged. And as I lay awake that night, residual fear still trembling deep in my veins, one singular truth stood clear above all the warnings. When true danger came, he didn't hesitate for a second. And when he said I was safe, I believed him implicitly. Italy glowed under a thick blanket of pre-Christmas lights. Every ornate street was lavishly wrapped in dazzling gold and deep, rich red, as if the entire historical city was attempting to pretend it was gentle and forgiving. Balconies shimmered with festive cheer. Shop windows reflected a manufactured warmth. For one silent night, even the darkest, most dangerous corners looked temporarily benign. Church bells echoed across the ancient city, slow and deliberate, sounding like fate itself counting down the final seconds. I felt the reverberation deep in my chest as I walked toward him. Each step was heavier than the last. Not because I didn't know what I was walking into, but precisely because I did. He had invited me to dinner. He hadn't asked permission. The message had been simple and dictatorial. A time, a place, no explanations, no implied pressure. And somehow, that stark lack of argument made it utterly impossible to refuse. Men like him did not issue demands. They simply assumed your answer before the question was even formed. The restaurant was silent, closed entirely to the public. Tall candles lined the walls, casting deep, dramatic shadows that moved like unspoken secrets across the frescoed ceiling. There were no visible guards. But I knew better. Protection of his caliber didn't need to be seen to be effective. He stood when I entered, immaculate in his black suit and stark white shirt. Controlled, precise, a study in quiet power. The same pervasive, confident calm that always surrounded him settled instantly into the room with me. "You came," he stated, his voice a low assurance. "Yes," I replied. That was all that truly needed to be said. Dinner unfolded in near silence. Not awkward, but deeply intentional. He watched me with the intense focus men like him watched everything, aware of every slight shift in posture, every minute change in my breathing pattern. I could feel his immense restraint like a palpable presence of its own, tightly coiled and waiting. Finally, he broke the quiet. "Do you know what I am?" he asked, his gaze pinning me. "Yes." "You know what my world does to people?" "Yes." He studied me carefully, deliberately, as if internally weighing every possible catastrophic consequence of my proximity. "And you're still here." It wasn't a question. It was a simple observation of fact. "I am," I confirmed. Outside, the bells rang again, louder this time. Midnight drew closer, Christmas pressing in around us, wrapping danger in layers of tradition and incandescent light. "You should hate this," he said quietly, a low challenge. "You should hate me." I admitted, the truth startling even myself. Why? I searched for the complex, logical answer and found only simple, unassailable truth. Because when I was afraid, you were there. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened, never softened, but deepened, like a crucial boundary line being irrevocably crossed inside him this time. I don't offer safety lightly, he said. And once I do, it doesn't get taken back. The candlelight caught the darkness of his eyes, turning them almost warm. Almost. I won't lie to you, he continued, his tone flat. Being near me will change you. I know you will lose the life you had. I realized I was already losing it, piece by mundane piece. Silence settled again, heavy yet surprisingly comfortable. Tell me to stop, he said suddenly, his voice sharp. I looked at him, startled. And if I do? I will, he answered. This once. The brutal honesty of the offer shook me deeply. I finally understood that this wasn't strictly about control anymore. It was about choice. My choice. The bells rang again. Closer now, louder, announcing the hour. I didn't tell him to stop. I slowly lifted my glass instead. It's Christmas, I said softly, the words hanging between us like fragile ornaments. His gaze held mine, intense and completely unwavering. Yes, he replied, and nothing is ever accidental on nights like this. The city glowed outside, pretending the world was simple and kind. Inside, fate leaned closer, and neither of us moved away from its presence. That's when he leaned in. Not suddenly, not with a burst of predatory urgency, but slowly, like a man who knew that all of time belonged to him. The physical space between us disappeared inch by deliberate inch, and with it, the careful illusion that I was still untouched by his terrifying world. I could feel the residual warmth radiating from him before he spoke, the steady, rhythmic control in his breathing, the profound certainty that lived in every movement he made. Tonight, he murmured, his voice so low that it felt like it belonged only to my skin, penetrating the surface. Every part of you will be mine. The words didn't strike like a sudden, demanding flash of desire. They settled instead like an unavoidable truth. Not lust, but a final, binding vow. My heart didn't fight the pronouncement. That was the most terrifying, absolute part. I had imagined a moment like this would come with fear, sharp enough to cut, with a panic loud enough to drown out everything else. But instead, there was only stillness, a deep, knowing quiet, like something essential inside me had been patiently waiting for these exact words long before I ever understood their potential meaning. I should have pulled back immediately. I didn't. You shouldn't say things like that, I whispered, the air thin between our lips. I don't say things I don't mean, he replied, his eyes never leaving mine. There was no hunger there, no desperate rush to claim what he spoke of. What I saw instead was pure, focused intent, controlled and unshakable. You're not asking, I observed. No, he agreed smoothly. I'm telling you what will happen if you allow it. A choice. Still a choice that mattered more to me than he probably realized. What does mine mean to you? I asked, needing the definition. His gaze darkened, becoming thoughtful, proprietary. It means protected, chosen, untouched by anyone who hasn't earned the right to stand where I stand. And if I say no? He didn't hesitate, his answer delivered with immediate clarity. Then I will step back. I searched his face for the lie, for the manipulation, for the hidden threat concealed behind the veneer of power. There was none. You don't belong to me yet, he continued quietly. That's why it matters. The candlelight flickered rapidly between us, the shadows moving as if they possessed a life of their own. Outside, the city breathed, entirely unaware that something permanent and irreversible was being decided in this small, quiet space. I realized then that this wasn't ultimately about the possession of my body. It was about claiming my rightful place in his volatile world, in his terrifying future, in the shielded part of him no one else had ever reached. You destroy everything you touch, I repeated softly, testing the limit again. His jaw tightened, a hard, sharp line forming. I destroy what threatens what's mine. And what if I am the threat? His eyes softened just barely enough to make my chest genuinely ache with sudden emotion. "Then I'll destroy myself before I let you fall." The words wrapped around me, heavy with both impossible promise and immediate danger. Men like him didn't make vows lightly or casually. They carved them permanently into the foundation of their lives. My pulse raced now, but not from fear. It raced from a sudden, fierce surrender. Not to him, but to the overwhelming, inescapable truth between us. I leaned in just slightly, closing the last inch of space without physically touching him. "Then don't lie to me," I whispered. "Not tonight. Not ever." "I don't lie," he said. "I warn." The bells outside rang again. A loud, clear chime. Midnight. Christmas had officially arrived. "This night changes things," he stated. "Yes," I replied. "It already has." He didn't kiss me. He didn't even touch me beyond that proximity. Instead, he stayed close. Close enough that I felt claimed without being taken, chosen without being owned. And in that moment, I understood something final and terrifyingly absolute. When a man like him whispers a vow, the world listens carefully. And my heart already had. I trembled violently. Not because I was weak. Not because I didn't finally understand the gravity of the danger standing in front of me. I trembled because I wanted him. The truth settled into my chest slowly, heavily, irrevocably. Like a final verdict I couldn't possibly appeal. Wanting a man like him wasn't foolish or misguided. It was utterly fatal. Desire in his world didn't come without immense consequences. It came with chains, with bloodshed, with choices that could never be undone or forgotten. And yet my body betrayed none of that sharp logic. My pulse raced when he stood too close. My breath shortened severely when his gaze held mine. Fear and desire tangled tightly together until I couldn't discern where one dangerous emotion ended and the other began. "That's the danger," he said quietly, as if he possessed the ability to read the violent war raging inside my mind. "Not fear." I looked up at him, bewildered. "Then what is it?" "Wanting," he replied, the word a soft accusation. "Wanting something you know will systematically change you." He was right. Fear was simple and reactive. Fear made you instinctively run. Desire was complex. Desire made you absolutely stay. I took a deliberate step back, forcing some desperately needed space between us. "You don't get to decide what I feel." "No," he agreed, "but I get to decide what I do with it." The candlelight painted his face in deep shadows, sharpening the hard edges, softening nothing about him. He looked like a man built from pure, immutable control, yet standing directly in the middle of something that genuinely threatened to undo that control. "I've spent my entire life avoiding men like you," I said. "Men who simply take and never ask." "And yet," he said calmly, "you're still here." "Yes," I admitted, the word a painful concession. "And that terrifies me more than anything." "That's honesty," he acknowledged. "I respect that." The word respect didn't belong in this fraught moment. Not with him. Not with the violence and absolute power he represented. And yet it fit too perfectly to entirely ignore. I turned away from him, needing air, needing distance from the suffocating presence of his commitment. The window showed Italy glowing below. Lights, laughter, celebration. The world pretending it was harmless. "People like you don't get happy endings," I stated softly, staring out at the distant glow. "No," he agreed instantly. "We get responsibilities." I laughed once, a sharp, humorless sound that fractured the quiet. "That's your version of comfort." "It's the truth," he said, unbothered. "And I don't soften truths for anyone." I faced him again, my resolve strengthening. "If I step toward you, I don't just risk myself. I risk becoming someone I no longer recognize." He didn't deny the consequence. "Yes, and you're still asking me to choose." "Yes." Silence pressed in around us, thick and encompassing. "You're afraid you'll lose yourself," he continued, reading my fear with uncanny accuracy. "You won't." "How do you know that?" "Because I won't allow it," he said simply, as if controlling my identity was a matter of course. "I protect what's mine without ever erasing it." The fierce possessiveness in his words should have instantly repelled me. Instead, horrifyingly, it steadied me. That realization frightened me more than anything else. I understood then that the clear line between fear and desire was gone. They fed each other, sharpened each other, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't fully see yet, but felt in my bones. "You're dangerous," I summarized. "Yes," he replied, accepting the truth. "And you're honest," I added. "Yes." The dual admission hung heavy between us. I took a deep, grounding breath. "If I do this," I said, "it's not because you scared me into it." "I know," he said, his expression unchanged. "It's because I want you." His gaze darkened, not with base hunger, but with something far heavier. Responsibility, ownership, a promise of eternal vigilance. "Then we move carefully," he said. "Together." I nodded slowly, accepting the full, terrifying weight of what that agreement meant. Because wanting him wasn't weakness anymore. It was a choice. And in his high-stakes world, choices were the only things that truly, violently mattered. I didn't step away again. And that single, anchored decision, more than fear, more than raw desire, was the moment everything truly changed. "I don't touch innocence," he said quietly, his eyes distant. "I ruin it." The words weren't a warning this time. They were a profound confession, wrung from a lifetime of violence. I studied his face in the flickering candlelight, searching desperately for cruelty, for pride, for any discernible emotion that would make those chilling words easier to accept. I found none. What I saw instead was a calculated distance, carefully built, heavily guarded by years of practice. "How do you know I'm innocent?" I asked, challenging his assumption. His jaw tightened again. "Because you still believe people can choose not to destroy what they love." The answer landed harder and more painfully than I expected. "You weren't always like this," I said, stating another clear truth. "No," he agreed. "I wasn't." Silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken history I hadn't yet been privy to. Outside, the city continued its manic celebrating. Inside, something darker pressed forward, demanding to be acknowledged and understood. "I grew up learning that mercy was a weakness," he said finally, his voice a remote monotone. That hesitation was the same as a death sentence. He didn't look at me when he spoke. His gaze drifted somewhere far away, to a time that still clearly lived under his skin. "My father believed in absolute loyalty above everything," he continued, "and betrayal deserved only one swift ending." I didn't interrupt. Some truths needed vast, silent space to unfold. "I was taught how to pull the trigger before I was taught how to trust," he said, the admission heavy. "By the time I truly understood what innocence was, it was already gone from me." I felt a physical tightening in my chest. "Power came early," he went on, "too early, and with it came choices no young man should ever have to make. Every decision carved something vital out of me. I saw it then, the overwhelming weight he carried, the profound cost of every calm moment, every controlled breath he took. Men didn't become like him by mere accident. They were shaped by catastrophic loss, sharpened brutally by necessary survival. That's why I don't touch innocence," he repeated, circling back to his starting point. "Because everything I touch carries my world with it, staining it." I met his gaze then, refusing to allow him to look away from me. "Maybe I'm stronger than you think," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could soften their impact. Something broke in his eyes. Not loudly, not completely shattered, but just enough to let a fleeting glimpse of the man beneath the control show through. Strength wasn't something he expected from someone like me. He had consistently mistaken my quiet observation for fragility, my caution for inherent weakness. "You shouldn't have to be," he said, his voice low and ragged. "But I am," I replied firmly, "and I choose to be." The undeniable weight of that choice settled heavily between us. "Do you think you'll survive my world unchanged?" he challenged, testing my resolve. "No," I answered honestly. "I think I'll survive it with you." His breath visibly slowed. The absolute control he wore so effortlessly cracked just enough for me to see the vulnerable man beneath it, shocked and exposed. "No one has ever said that to me," he admitted, the words barely audible. "That doesn't mean it isn't true." He looked away again, his jaw clenched hard, as if physically struggling to steady himself. When he looked back, The man in front of me was still dangerously lethal, but something fundamental had shifted in the balance. "You don't understand what loving me costs," he warned. "Then teach me," I replied. The words hung in the charged air, heavy and irreversible. "I ruin things," he said softly. "Yes," I agreed. "But you also protect them." For the very first time since I'd known him, he didn't have an immediate, controlled answer ready. Because I had touched something buried deep beneath the violence and the immense power. I had touched the sliver of him that still remembered who he could have been, given different circumstances. And that specific vulnerability, more than desire, more than fear, was what truly frightened him. The first gunshot didn't sound real. It cracked the Christmas night like a painful lie being exposed. Sharp, violent, and absolutely final. Then came the second, much closer this time. Everything changed in a single, chaotic heartbeat. Shouting exploded outside the restaurant. Rapid footsteps. Commands barked in short, precise, deadly Italian. The fragile calm of the Christmas night shattered utterly. Glass broke somewhere far down the street. My body froze instantly, long before my mind could catch up to the reality. He moved instantly and violently. One moment I was standing alone in the candle light, the next I was pulled hard against his solid chest. Not gently, but brutally protective. His arm wrapped around me, solid and unbreakable, spinning me so my back was completely pressed to him. I felt his heartbeat, slow, controlled, lethally calm. A human shield of muscle and power. A concrete wall between me and the sudden chaos. "Stay still," he murmured fiercely near my ear. Not a panic, but an absolute command. Another gunshot echoed, deafeningly loud this time. My hands involuntarily clenched into his coat fabric. I hadn't even realized I'd grabbed him until I felt the expensive fabric tighten under my fingers. My breath came fast, shallow, useless. "Who is it?" I whispered against his shoulder. "Enemies," he replied simply. No trace of anger, no fear, just the absolute truth of his existence. His men flooded the quiet room in seconds, weapons already drawn, their faces sharp with focused, trained readiness. They moved like a flawlessly engineered machine built for instantaneous violence. Doors were secured with silent efficiency. Lights were dimmed strategically. One of them spoke quickly into a radio in clipped tones. I had irrevocably stepped into his world, and his world had violently answered. He shifted slightly, placing himself fully in front of me now, blocking my view, blocking everything. I realized then that this was pure instinct. He didn't have to think about protecting me, he just executed the action. Another isolated shot rang out, then a terrible silence. Heavy, waiting, dangerous. I felt his large hand press against my lower back, grounding me, anchoring me physically to him. "Breathe," he said softly, like he was calming something intensely fragile and precious. "I'm here," I whispered, though I didn't know why I needed to say it. Perhaps I needed him to know I hadn't been obliterated by the fear. "I know," he said. Minutes passed, stretching out like hours. Then, footsteps retreated. Voices faded into the distance. A man approached him and spoke quietly, deferentially. I didn't catch the words, but I saw the change in his eyes. Cold calculation. The settling of control. "It's over," he said finally. But it wasn't. Not really. He turned to me, his hands still firm on my shoulders. I expected him to step back, to release me now that the immediate danger had passed. He didn't. Instead, his grip tightened just enough to compel me to look up at his face. "This," he said slowly, deliberately, "is what my life looks like." I swallowed hard, tasting the lingering fear. "I know." "No," he countered. "You feel it now." I nodded, my body still trembling uncontrollably, the adrenaline still burning fiercely through my veins. "Yes." His thumb brushed my cheek. Not tender, a quality far removed from the rough, demanding grip I expected. This possessiveness was redefined. It was profoundly, terrifyingly real. "From now on," he stated, his voice dropping low, absolute, settling the matter irrevocably. "You are mine now, and I will be the shield between you and the storm." The declaration resonated. settling in the deepest part of my soul. It wasn't the heavy chain of ownership, but the solemn, unbreakable weight of a true vow. I didn't ask for this life, I whispered, the admission a fragile thing in the charged air. I know, he replied, but the moment they saw you standing with me, you became inextricably part of this war. Fear flared again, a flash of old anxiety, quickly drowned by a surging, unexpected current of trust. It was an anomaly in this world, but undeniably present. And if I walk away, I asked, needing the answer to be clean. His gaze held mine, unflinching, utterly transparent. I won't let them touch you. That was the response. Not I won't let you leave. Not control. Only protection. I realized then that his world did not bring only enemies and shadows. Loyalty was also an absolute commodity here. And once you were sheltered under his protection, nothing dared cross that sacred line. I nodded slowly, acknowledging the magnitude of the exchange. Outside, the wail of distant sirens was a cold reminder of the city's unrest. Christmas lights flickered weakly over the splintered remnants of broken glass. Inside, I stood encased in the arms of Italy's most feared Mafia king. And for the first time since the initial gunshots, I felt profoundly, utterly safe. He gave me a choice, a genuine, unadulterated choice. Not a test of devotion, not a hidden trap, not a threat thinly disguised as an opportunity. Leave, he said, his voice calm, terrifyingly controlled. Forget me entirely. Go back to your quiet life. Live safely, simply. There will be no consequences, no lingering chaos. I will erase you from the periphery. I saw the ghost of the life I had meticulously constructed. Safe, predictable streets, the mundane comfort of familiar routines. That life was home, yes, built brick by careful brick. But the image was suddenly sterile, bleached of color. It felt empty now, desolate and hollow, as if the person who belonged there had already crossed an irreversible threshold. He continued, his eyes dark, unwavering, fixing me with an intensity that demanded honesty. And you will belong to my world, irrevocably tied to its shadows, its brutal calculus, and my choices. Everything I am, the reputation, the darkness, the demands, you accept it all. I felt the weight of that final sentence, crushing like a physical hand pressed against my chest. Belonging to him wasn't simply desire. Do you understand what that means, truly? He asked softly, testing the depth of my resolve. Do you comprehend the darkness you are willingly stepping into? Yes, I said. I understand. He studied me for a long, quiet moment. The faintest shadow of something passed across his eyes. It was not doubt, not fear, simply precise calculation. And something else. Something nameless that resonated in my chest. Trust. You don't know what you're actually giving up, he said finally. I do, I replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. But I know what I'm gaining. He didn't move immediately, didn't reach out for me, didn't pull me into his embrace. His silence was weighty, deliberate, as if the full, terrifying gravity of the choice had to sink into both of us. I warned you, he said quietly. I told you that nothing about me is safe, that nothing about my world is gentle, that once you step in, there's no path of retreat. And I still step, I said. His gaze softened just enough that I could glimpse the man hidden behind the legend, behind the ruthless violence, behind the fear he commanded. You are braver than any I have known. He finally murmured, the observation devoid of flattery. Or perhaps unbearably reckless. I met his eyes and shrugged slightly. Maybe both. A tense, brief smile ghosted his lips. Then it's done. You've made your choice, and now you must live by it. I took another step, closing the final distance between us. Not asking, not demanding, simply belonging. Because belonging wasn't about surrender of will. It was about absolute decision. And in that decision, I finally felt the truth. I didn't just want him. I chose him, and from this moment, there was no possibility of turning back. He extended his hand, an invitation, not a command. My fingers closed around his, and the surrounding darkness of his world did not repel me. Felt, instead, like a fierce embrace, a brutal welcome. He did not rush to claim a kiss, nor did he press his touch to my skin. That deliberate restraint, the controlled pause, held more palpable, undeniable power than any forceful possession. We stood close. So close I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the quiet, immense force he carried without effort. His hand hovered near my waist, not claiming, not demanding, controlled, intentional, as if he were reminding himself that he could take everything, but chose the slow path instead. Mine, he stated, the word soft, a velvet hammer between us. It needed no volume to carry absolute finality. Not ownership in the vulgar way the outside world would interpret it, but responsibility, the highest form of protection, an unbreakable decree that, once sealed, could never be rescinded. That was enough. My breath hitched, not from shock, but from profound recognition. Something deep inside me answered that word before my mind could even register the impulse. Not resistance, not lingering fear. Acceptance. I nodded once, slowly. Yours, I confirmed. The atmosphere between us crackled, not with mere lust, but with the profound, unsettling energy of alignment. His jaw tightened slightly, as if my agreement cost him something immense, as if the gravity of the moment mattered far more than he wished it would. His fingers flexed near my waist, still not touching, still holding back the inevitable release of tension. You have no comprehension of the power you just ceded to me, he said, his voice barely audible. I do, I replied steadily, and I offered it willingly. His gaze dropped to my lips for half a second, then lifted again, forcing his iron control back into place. That discipline, that powerful restraint, told me everything I truly needed to know. This man didn't lose control. He chose precisely when to unleash it. I don't make empty claims, he said. When I claim something as mine, I defend it with the entirety of my name, and if necessary, with my blood. I believed him without question. Men like him didn't exaggerate to impress. They survived by meaning every word they spoke. And if the world comes for me, I asked. It will come through me first, he answered, the certainty in his voice a dense, impenetrable layer of armor. Not false comfort, not flowery romance, but truth stripped bare. I took a small step closer, eliminating the last sliver of space between us. I felt his breath warm against my hair, his presence enclosing me completely without needing to touch. This isn't a game, he warned softly. I know, I said. That's precisely why I'm here. Something shifted in him then. Subtle but unmistakable. A door closing behind us. Path sealed shut. He finally let his hand rest against my waist. Not tight, not possessive, but grounded, protective, real. And in that single, profound touch I understood everything. This wasn't about passion alone. This was about territory, unbreakable loyalty, and the forging of fate, the kind of bond that didn't need constant proof because once claimed it was permanent. He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. No one touches what's mine. And for the first time, the word didn't scare me away. It anchored me because being claimed by a man like him didn't mean losing myself. It meant being chosen and choosing him right back with equal force. The air tightened the following week. They tried to test the boundary to use me against him. I didn't recognize the strategy at first. The threats were subtle, insidious. Small, cold whispers in my ear. Strangers asking too many pointed questions. Notes slipped under doors that vanished as quickly as they appeared. I thought I was simply being paranoid, the fear still conditioning my mind, until the first real trap was sprung. It came in the form of a man I had actually trusted, a casual acquaintance I had believed was harmless. He smiled when he greeted me, but his eyes held something sharp, calculated, dangerous. You know he can't protect you forever, he said casually, letting the full weight of the implied menace sink in. You could be useful if you cooperate. The implication was a cold knife. Betray him, and your life might be granted a temporary stay. Refuse, and the consequences would be absolute. I didn't respond. I knew better than to negotiate with men steeped in that kind of darkness. They weren't interested in my reasoning or pleas. They were interested only in leverage. I left immediately, but by the time I reached the street, I knew. He knew. Because men like him see every shifting shadow, anticipate every maneuver. I felt it before I heard him. The sudden, chilling absence of the usual city noise. The controlled, heavy shifting of a presence behind me. A shadow precise and utterly controlled. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. His men materialized, swift and silent, forming a perfect, disciplined perimeter around me. Protective, silent, ready for bloodshed. And then he was simply there. No warning. No flash of anger. Just that same calm, devastating intensity that made my body shiver. You were used, he said, his voice low, controlled, deadly. Yes, I admitted. I didn't. He silenced me with a look, taking one slow, deliberate step closer. No excuses. No mistakes. You are mine, and anyone who dares to threaten that claim. He let the threat hang, unfinished, unnecessary. The world would understand the rest. The retribution was instantaneous, surgical, leaving no witnesses and less evidence. Shadows moved, car doors slammed shut, and the entire looming threat vanished as quietly as it had appeared. No one in the city knew who they were or why they had vanished. Just silence. A statement. Powerful warning. The silent consensus settled over Italy that night. Everyone understood the cost of attempting to touch what the king had chosen to love. He turned to me after the last echo faded, the night returning to its cold, controlled calm. The slightest smirk touched his lips. Not cruel, not playful, just raw, brutal acknowledgement of his own effectiveness. From this moment forward, you are untouchable, he declared softly. Because of you? I asked, my voice shaking slightly from the adrenaline that refused to subside. Because of me, he corrected. And because of you, you choose to stand by me. That makes all the difference in the world. I realized then that betrayal wasn't simply about deceit or lies. It was about consequences, about who holds the ultimate power and who survives the aftermath. And he survived everything. I shivered again, not from fear this time, but from the searing truth of it. Men like him didn't forgive easily, but they also didn't hesitate to protect what was theirs. And if you belonged to them, truly belonged, no one could ever touch you again. That night, I understood what being his truly meant. Not just desire, not just danger, but power, loyalty, possession, and the kind of fierce, absolute love that could never be threatened. I have commanded armies of men, he said, his voice dropping to an intimate depth. But you stand in judgment over me. The words fell heavy between us, more dangerous, more revealing than any threat he had ever spoken to an enemy. I looked at him, searching his face for deception, for irony, for the control that usually shielded him. There was none. This was not the confession of weakness. It was the unvarnished truth of absolute surrender, the kind of transparency no enemy had ever witnessed. The room was silent, lit only by low lamps and the distant glow of the city outside. Italy slept, utterly unaware that its most feared king was standing before me, lowering his guard in a way no one would have believed possible. I do not kneel, he continued, his gaze holding mine, challenging the very notion. I do not confess fault. I don't surrender territory. He paused, then met my eyes fully. Except now. My breath caught painfully. I built my life on total control, he said. Fear keeps men loyal. Power keeps them obedient. But you, his voice roughened slightly, you don't fear me, and you certainly don't obey me. I choose you, I said softly. A slow exhale left him, a release of pressure he always carried. Exactly. He took one measured step back, creating space, and then, deliberately, he bowed his head. Not deeply, not theatrically. Once. A brief lowering of his crown, a gesture so rare it felt entirely unreal. It was the silent, devastating acknowledgement of a king to his queen, performed in private, where all posturing ceased and only truth remained. To you, he said quietly. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break my ribs. You don't have to do this. I do, he replied, because this isn't submission. It's allegiance. I stepped toward him, lifting his chin gently with my fingertips, forcing him to look at me again. I don't want your throne. A corner of his mouth lifted, a real, small movement. I know. That's why you deserve it. He straightened, the full weight of his power settling back into place. But something had changed. The granite wall surrounding his heart had not vanished. But now, finally, it held a door. And I was standing inside. I don't promise safety, he said, his voice firming. I don't promise peace. My world is built on enemies and blood debts. I don't need promises, I replied. I need honesty. He nodded once. Then hear this. If the world dares to turn its cruel face against you, I will burn it down to ash to keep you warm. If fate demands a sacrifice, it will be mine before it touches yours. The words weren't dramatic or hyperbolic. They were factual, spoken by a man who had already counted the cost and accepted the absolute payment. And if loving me makes you weak, I asked. His eyes darkened, not with anger, but with absolute certainty. Then I will be the strongest weak man Italy has ever known. I laughed softly, tears stinging my eyes at the impossible honesty of the man before me. You're impossible. Yes, he said, his gaze locking with mine. But I am yours. The confession settled deep in my chest. This wasn't romance built on fantasy. It was loyalty forged in fire, trust born in the deepest darkness. He reached for my hand, and our fingers laced, a connection that felt equal, balanced, definitive. I rule men, he said again, softer now, acknowledging the shared moment. But you rule me, and in that moment, I understood the deep mechanics of his empire. Power doesn't come from fear alone. True power kneels once to love. The dawn arrived, not heralded by the crack of gunshots or the residue of threats, but by a profound, almost impossible quiet, accompanied by the sight of snow. Soft, slow, forgiving snow drifting down over the city, settling on rooftops and streets as if the world itself was choosing peace, at least for a fleeting moment. Church bells began to ring in the distance, their echoes gentle now, no longer counting down to chaos, but welcoming the Christmas morning. I stood watching the fragile light, wrapped entirely in his massive jacket. It dwarfed me, heavy with his lingering warmth, carrying the distinct scent of expensive leather, smoke, and an intensity that was unmistakably his. Protection stitched into the very fabric. Behind me, the room remained still, quiet, safe. He joined me without a sound, standing close but not touching me. The city bowed under the pale winter light. Italy was glowing in hues of white and cold gold. For the first time since I'd known him, there were no visible guards in the room, no weapons casually displayed, just a man and a woman watching the morning breathe. This, he said softly, breaking the long silence, is exceedingly rare. What is? I whispered back. Peace, he replied, the single word a weighty commodity in his domain. I leaned into him slightly, my shoulder brushing his chest. He didn't move away. He didn't tighten his hold either. He simply allowed it to be. The bells rang again, clearer this time. I didn't think your world ever slept, I said. It doesn't, he admitted, but sometimes it rests. I turned to look at him. The hard, familiar lines of his face were softened by the cool morning light. No crown, no throne, just tired eyes that had seen far too much and still chose to stay standing. You could leave now, he said suddenly, the offer unexpected. Dawn changes things. It gives people courage. I searched his face, trying to discern his true desire. Do you want me to? No, he said immediately, without hesitation. Then, after a pause, but I respect that you could. I smiled faintly. I'm still here, I confirmed. He merely nodded, accepting my presence like a gift he had demanded but never truly believed he deserved. Outside, people were waking. Families, lovers, children running to trees and gifts and warmth. Normal lives unfolding, utterly different from his world. And yet I was part of it now. His world. My world. He lifted his hand, adjusting the heavy jacket around my shoulders, making sure it was tight enough to keep the cold out. A simple gesture, domestic, almost unreal in its tenderness. This isn't a dream, I said quietly. No, he replied, his voice firm. Dreams end. I watched the snow fall, the city glowing under the soft promise of morning light. What happens now? He considered the question for a long moment. Now, he finally stated. We simply live with what we have chosen. No regret. No hesitation. I nodded. Then I choose it again. His hand found mine, fingers interlacing naturally, as if they'd always known where they belonged. Not a claim, not a vow, just pure, undeniable connection. The bells rang one last time, louder now, welcoming Christmas fully into the streets. And in that quiet dawn, wrapped in his jacket, standing at the edge of his world, I realized something simple, yet utterly unshakable. I was not lost within his darkness. I had, finally, found my way home. Fate brought you to me, he said quietly, gazing out at the pale promise of the sky. We stood together as the last vestiges of night faded. The city was awake now, alive with Christmas morning, doors opening, laughter carrying through the streets, bells echoing softer, warmer. And I will ensure that no force, not fate nor man nor God, will ever take you away from me. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize the vow. Men like him didn't need to. His promises were constructed the same way his empire was. Deliberate, unbreakable. I turned to face him fully. Fate did not force my hand. I countered. I chose you. A slow breath left him. Relief, acceptance, something close to true peace. I know, he replied. That's why it matters more than anything. We had crossed every line together. Fear, desire, blood, loyalty. There was nothing left unsaid. Now, there were no illusions about what his world truly was. No fantasy that love would soften it completely into something gentle. But love didn't need to make it gentle. It needed only to make it true. I can't promise a normal life, he said. There will be danger. There will be enemies. There will be nights you'll desperately wish were quieter. I smiled faintly, the ghost of a challenge in my eyes. I've already had quiet. It wasn't living. His eyes held mine, dark and certain. Then you understand what forever means with me. Yes, I said. It means standing when it's hardest. Choosing again every time fear returns. Trusting that even in darkness, I won't be alone. He reached up, resting his forehead against mine. No kiss, no forceful claim, just absolute closeness. I don't fear losing power, he said softly, the words vibrating through my own skull. I fear losing you. The honesty in his voice wrapped around my heart. This was not the confession of a weak man. It was the truth of a supremely strong one who finally knew what he could not afford to sacrifice. I'm not going anywhere, I whispered. Outside, the first patches of snow had begun to melt, leaving the city clean, renewed. Christmas morning moved forward, unaware, untouched by the profound vows spoken in shadowed rooms. I was born into darkness, he said, pulling back slightly. It shaped me, hardened me, demanded everything. He lifted my hand, pressing it firmly over his chest. But you made it mine to share. I felt his heartbeat steady, unwavering beneath my palm. In your darkness, I said softly, I found my forever. He smiled then, not the dangerous curve of a Mafia king, but something real, human, and exceptionally rare. Then we walk forward together, he said. Whatever comes, hand in hand, not above or below, not ruler and possession, but partners bound by fate and by choice. Forever wasn't a fairy tale waiting to be found. Forever was a terrifying decision, and we had already made it, absolutely. Some love stories are soft, some are safe, and some are written in shadow, where danger and devotion walk hand in hand. If this story made your pulse race, if you believe love can rise even from darkness, if fate, power, and forever speak to something deep inside you, then this channel is for you. Subscribe now for more dark romance stories, Mafia love tales, and emotionally gripping narrations that stay with you long after the night ends. Because some stories don't just entertain, they find you and they claim you. And the next one is already waiting.
My flag sings vipers to the sky. Melodies flows gentle and free, carrying dreams across the sea. In every note, a piece of me, forever here in harmony. My flood sings vipers to the sky. Melodies flows gentle and free, carrying dreams across the sea. In every note, a piece of me, forever here in harmony. Music lives inside my heart. Music lives inside my heart.